What Ivy saw broke her heart. Through the slightly ajar door of room 412, there they were. It wasn't the dramatic, cinematic explosion of betrayal she might have expected. It was the domesticity of it that felt like a slow-turning blade. Bora, the woman who had held Ivy's hand at her mother's funeral, was wearing the silk robe Ivy had gifted her for her birthday. Insu, the man who had promised to build a world around Ivy, was laughing. It was a soft, intimate sound, a low vibration of genuine contentment that used to belong only to their private mornings. Through the door, Ivy watched as Insu reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind Bora's ear with a familiarity that suggested this was not a first-time mistake, but a well-worn habit. Ivy stood in the dim, pressurized silence of the hotel hallway, her fingers barely brushing the cold brass of the door handle. She didn't push the door wide. She didn't scream or demand the explanation she knew would be a lie. She stayed in the shadows, a ghost at the feast of her own life, anchored to the spot by a sickening realization. The text message from the unknown number that had led her here at 2 a.m., the cruel, calculated tip-off, had been right. But the detail the message hadn't captured was the most devastating. The door hadn't been left ajar by accident. As Ivy watched, Bora's eyes flicked toward the door. For a split second, their gazes didn't meet, but Ivy saw the small, triumphant curve of Bora's lips. Bora knew she was there. She had left the door open like a trap, wanting Ivy to witness the exact moment her reality disintegrated. She wanted Ivy to see that every secret shared over late-night coffee and every promise Insu had whispered into Ivy's skin had been a currency they used to mock her behind her back. The silence in the hallway felt heavy, like it was filled with the ghosts of the 3 years Ivy had wasted. She thought of the sacrifices she had made for Insu's career, the way she had made herself smaller so his ego could breathe, and the way she had trusted Bora with her deepest insecurities. All of it was now fuel for their fire. The silence lasted for exactly 10 seconds before Ivy turned away. In those 10 seconds, the sound of her heart breaking was not a sharp snap, but the sound of something soft and vulnerable hardening into cold, unyielding stone. She didn't want a confrontation, she wanted an exit. As she pivoted, leaving the laughter behind, the weight of the betrayal settled into her marrow. She was no longer the woman who had walked into this hotel. That woman was dead, left behind in the sliver of light coming from room 412. Ivy walked toward the elevators, each step a rhythmic vow that she would never again be a spectator in her own life. Ivy retreated from the door of room 412, her feet moving across the plush corridor carpet with the mechanical precision of a soldier fleeing a scorched earth. The air in the hallway felt thin, insufficient for the sudden, crushing weight in her chest. She reached the bank of elevators, her hand trembling as she pressed the call button, but the metal doors remained shut, mocking her need for a quick escape. Her knees, usually so reliable, began to give way, the adrenaline that had carried her here curdling into a heavy, cold despair. "The air is better if you breathe through your nose," a voice said, cutting through the silence of the hallway like a serrated blade. Ivy flinched, spinning around to find a man leaning against the mahogany paneling of the service alcove. It was Kang Min-hyuk. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the dim light of the hotel, his presence so absolute that it seemed to shrink the corridor around them. To the public, he was the vice architect, a man who rebuilt skylines and dismantled rivals with equal indifference. To Ivy, he was the ghost who sat in the back of the legal briefings she translated, a man who never spoke, but always seemed to be calculating the cost of every word. He didn't move to steady her. He didn't offer a handkerchief or a hollow word of comfort. He simply watched her, his dark eyes tracing the tracks of the tears she hadn't realized were falling. "I have been watching that door for 40 minutes, he stated, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "Insu is a man of predictable appetites, and Bora is a woman of expensive debts. They are a logical equation, Ivy. You are the only variable that doesn't fit." Ivy wiped her face with the back of her hand, her pride flaring through the pain. "You knew? You've been tracking them." "I don't track people for sport," Min-hyuk replied, pushing off the wall and taking a deliberate step into her space. "I track assets. Insu has been leveraging your family's connections to cover his gambling losses in Macau. Bora has been feeding information to your competitors in exchange for a clean slate on her own father's bankruptcy. They didn't just break your heart, they've been harvesting your life for parts." He reached out, his gloved fingers catching a stray tear before it could reach her chin. He didn't wipe it away gently, he crushed it. I am not here to save you, Ivy. I am here because the information you carry in your head, the legal backdoors to the Ensue Group, is too valuable to be left in a woman who is about to collapse. He leaned in closer, the scent of expensive tobacco and cold rain surrounding her. I have a penthouse in Hanamdong with a room that Ensue's name can never enter. I have a war room where we can dismantle everything they think they've won. You can stay here and wait for them to come out and offer you a scripted apology, or you can get in my car and become the most dangerous thing they've ever encountered. He pressed the elevator button for her, the doors sliding open with a soft chime. Don't cry, he commanded, his gaze pinning her to the spot. Crying is a confession of defeat. Walk out of this hotel with your head held high. Make them wonder why you aren't screaming. Make them wonder what I've told you. Ivy looked at the open elevator, then back at the man who was offering her a different kind of cage, one built of power and vengeance. She stepped inside. As the doors closed, severing her connection to the hallway and the ghosts of room 412, she realized she wasn't choosing a savior. She was choosing a weapon. Ensue arrived at the apartment at 5 a.m., the early morning fog of soul clinging to his expensive wool coat like a guilty conscience. He felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind that follows a successful deception, a cocktail of arrogance and the lingering heat of Bora's skin. He expected to find Ivy as he always did, asleep in their bed, her breathing steady, a predictable fixture in the home he had allowed her to decorate. He had his apology ready just in case she had woken up, a lie about a late-night site inspection, and a dead phone battery. He reached into his pocket, slid his keycard against the electronic lock, and waited for the familiar, welcoming chirp of the mechanism. Instead, the lock let out a long, jarring red beep. Ensue frowned, trying again. He cleaned the chip on his sleeve and pressed it firmly against the sensor. Red. Denied. A cold prickle of unease bypassed his ego and settled at the base of his neck. He hammered his fist against the mahogany door, the sound echoing hollowly down the silent hallway of the luxury complex. Ivy, he called out, his voice sounding thin in the empty air. There was no response. No muffled footsteps. No light flicking on under the door. He tried the service code, a sequence only he and Ivy knew. The system remained unresponsive. It was as if the apartment itself had developed a sudden, violent amnesia regarding his existence. When he finally gained entry an hour later through a bewildered building manager, the silence that met him was more devastating than a scream. The apartment was pristine, but it was hollow. He moved through the rooms with a growing sense of frantic urgency, looking for the debris of a confrontation. He expected to find a scorched note on the kitchen island, a shattered vase, or a suitcase dragged hastily across the floor. But there was nothing. No ink-stained letters. No angry calls lighting up his phone. Just a chilling, absolute absence. He opened the walk-in closet and stopped. Ivy's side was completely bare. She hadn't just left. She had erased herself. Every scent of her perfume, every stray hair on a brush, every piece of jewelry she had ever worn was gone. As he stood in the vacuum she had left behind, Ensue's confidence began its rapid, ugly descent into paranoia. He reached for his laptop to check his personal accounts, his fingers fumbling with the keys. The screen flickered to life, but the login screen was gone. In its place was a simple, blinking cursor and a message from the bank. Access revoked by primary trustee. The blood drained from Ensue's face. He wasn't just locked out of his home. He was locked out of his empire. Ivy was the one who managed the shell companies. She was the one who held the encrypted keys to the Macau accounts and the offshore shipping logs. As the sun began to rise over the Seoul skyline, painting the room in a cold, unforgiving gray, Ensue realized the true nature of her revenge. She hadn't stayed to fight him. She had simply taken the floor out from under him and vanished into the shadows, leaving him to fall in total silence. He reached for his phone to call Bora, but his hands were shaking so hard he dropped it. The predator had become the prey, and he didn't even know where the hunter was hiding. From the 62nd floor of the Kong Group headquarters, the world below looked like a sprawling, backlit chessboard. Ivy sat in the dim glow of Min Hyuk's private observation suite, her eyes fixed on a grid of high-definition monitors. On the center screen, Bora was performing. She was standing in front of Ivy's favorite cafe, surrounded by a small circle of their mutual acquaintances, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. To anyone watching, she was the picture of the grieving best friend, the anchor of a woman who had mysteriously vanished into the night. She has always been an exceptional actress, Min-hyuk remarked, his voice drifting from the shadows of the room. He walked toward the console and tapped a key, pulling up a secondary feed. It was a grainy, thermal recording from a private club in Gangnam, dated 2 months prior. Ivy watched as the thermal ghost of Bora handed a thick envelope to a man whose face was obscured. It wasn't just about In-soo, Ivy, Min-hyuk continued, his gaze cold. In-soo was the distraction. Bora's loyalty was sold long before he ever entered the picture. Your father's firm was responsible for the bankruptcy of the Choi Logistics empire 20 years ago. Bora isn't just your friend. She is the daughter of the man your family ruined. This isn't a petty affair. This is a generational blood debt. Ivy's breath hitched. The betrayal she had seen in room 412 had felt like a sudden, jagged wound. But this was something different. This was a parasite that had been living beside her for a decade, waiting for the body to weaken. Every shared secret, every hug, every moment of vulnerability had been a data point for a long-term execution. On the monitor, Bora turned away from the crowd, and for a split second, the mask slipped. Alone in the back of her car, Bora let out a sharp, jagged smile that made Ivy's skin crawl. It wasn't the smile of a woman in love. It was the smile of a woman who had finally tasted blood. You have been playing a game of emotions, Min-hyuk said, stepping into the light of the monitors. Bora is playing a game of erasure. If you want to survive her, you have to stop reacting and start architecting. You need the silent strike. He spent the next several hours teaching Ivy the mechanics of a shadow war. It wasn't about shouting or public scenes. It was about the systematic removal of a person's foundation. He showed her how to track Bora's offshore debt cycles and how to leak just enough information to the rival families to make Bora look like a double agent. Ivy watched the monitors, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, learning how to move through the digital world like a ghost. A silent strike doesn't announce itself, Min-hyuk whispered, his hand resting briefly on the back of her chair. It is the moment a person reaches for the floor and finds nothing but air. By the time she realizes you are the one pulling the strings, there will be no one left for her to call. Ivy stared at Bora's smiling face on the screen, her heart no longer breaking, but hardening into a weapon. The training had begun. She wasn't just going to take back her life. She was going to dismantle the woman who had tried to steal it, one silent click at a time. The grand ballroom of the Lotte Hotel was a cathedral of predatory ambition. It was the annual Founders Gala, an event where the hierarchy of Seoul's elite was recalibrated over vintage champagne. In-soo moved through the crowd with a forced, manic energy, his hand gripping Bora's arm with a desperation he hoped looked like affection. To the outside world, they were the new power couple, the survivors of Ivy's unfortunate breakdown and subsequent disappearance. In-soo had spent the last week spinning a narrative of a woman who had spiraled into instability, leaving him to pick up the pieces of their crumbling firm. Beside him, Bora was radiant in a shimmering champagne gown, her face a masterpiece of practiced humility and subtle triumph. They were deep in conversation with a major investor when a stunning grand entrance was made. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the space. Kang Min-hyuk stepped into the light. He didn't walk so much as he reclaimed the floor, his presence a dark, gravitational force that demanded total silence. But it wasn't Min-hyuk who caused the glasses to stop mid-clink and the whispers to die in throats. It was the woman on his arm. Ivy didn't look like a woman who had spent the last 10 days in hiding. She was draped in a silver gown of structured silk and obsidian, shimmering like the scales of a serpent. It wasn't a dress, it was a statement. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe knot, revealing a face that had been stripped of its warmth and replaced with a terrifying, marble-like clarity. She didn't look at the cameras, and she certainly didn't look at the man who had shared her bed for 3 years. In-soo felt the blood drain from his face, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He waited for the scene. He waited for Ivy to storm across the floor, to throw her drink in his face, or to scream the truth of room 412 to the gathered press. He was prepared for her rage. He had built his defense against her anger. But as Ivy and Min-hyuk glided past them, she didn't even blink. Her gaze remained fixed ahead, her eyes as vacant and cold as the deep ocean. She walked within inches of Bora, her hand brushing against Bora's shimmering dress, and she didn't offer so much as a flicker of recognition. It was as if In-soo and Bora had ceased to be physical matter, as if they were nothing more than the air she breathed and immediately discarded. The room went cold. The elite of Seoul watched as Min-hyuk leaned down, whispering something into Ivy's ear that made her lips tilt into a small, wide smile. In that moment, In-soo realized the gravity of his mistake. Rage would have meant she still cared. Rage would have been a bridge he could cross. But this absolute, clinical indifference was the sound of a door being locked from the outside. Ivy hadn't come to reclaim her place at his side. She had come to watch him realize that he no longer existed in her world. Under the bright lights of the gala, In-soo felt a cold sweat break across his brow. The hunt hadn't just begun. He was already in the trap. The air in the hotel's private sculpture garden was brittle with the scent of pine and impending frost. Ivy had stepped away from the suffocating heat of the ballroom, seeking the solace of the shadows, but she wasn't alone for long. The footsteps behind her signaled his approach before he even spoke. In-soo stepped out from behind, his tuxedo slightly disheveled, the mask of confidence he always had slipping to reveal the frantic, sweating man beneath. He didn't lead with an apology. He led with the only weapon he thought he still possessed: their shared history. "Ivy, stop this," he whispered, his voice cracking with a desperate, practiced intimacy. He moved into her personal space, reaching out as if to touch her shoulder, but stopped when he met the wall of her absolute stillness. "This isn't you. This coldness, this dress, this man you're standing with. It's a performance. You're hurting, and I get it. I made a mistake. But don't throw away 3 years for a moment of spite." Ivy didn't move. She didn't recoil from his proximity. She simply turned her head to look at him, her face partially illuminated by the distant glow of the lights. "Aina," he breathed, using the pet name he had reserved for the moments when she was most vulnerable. "Remember the weekend in Jeju? The promises we made under the stars? You can't tell me that meant nothing. You're my anchor. You've always been my anchor. Come home. We can fix the accounts. I can explain, Bora. It was just business that got out of hand. She's nothing to me." Ivy didn't blink. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time since they met, she wasn't looking for a future. She was performing an autopsy on the past. She began to count. 1. She saw the way his eyes darted to the side, looking for an exit even as he spoke of love. He wasn't afraid of losing her. He was afraid of losing the stability she provided. 2. She remembered the smell of the hotel hallway, the sight of Bora's ivory silk, and the sound of his laughter echoing through the ajar door. She realized that his anchor was just a word he used for someone he expected to hold the weight while he drifted. 3. The final second ticked by, a silent gavel falling in the courtroom of her mind. It was the exact amount of time she had stood outside room 412, the exact amount of time it took for the last spark of her old self to go dark. 10 seconds ensue, she said, her voice so steady it sounded like a death knell. He blinked, confused. What? What are you talking about? That's how long I stood at the door of room 412, she replied, stepping toward him until he was forced to back away into the shadow of the marble. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with a terrifying, newfound freedom. I saw the door was open in Sue. I saw the laughter. I saw the robe, and for a moment, I thought my world had ended. But standing here now, looking at you, I realized I was wrong. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a lethal, intimate whisper. The door wasn't open, so I could see your betrayal. It was open, so I could see my exit. Thank you, and especially Bora, for letting me out in Sue. I've never breathed better than I have since I left that hallway. She turned and walked back toward the lights, leaving him standing in the dark, clutching at a history that no longer had a witness. He tried to call her name, but the words died in his throat. He wasn't just a cheater anymore. He was a man who had realized too late that the woman he thought he owned had finally, irrevocably, become her own sovereign. The destruction of In-soo and Bora did not begin with a bang. It began with a soft, rhythmic hum of a high-speed industrial shredder in a basement office they didn't know existed. Min-hyuk sat in his high-backed chair, watching the financial feeds with the detached focus of a surgeon. Beside him, Ivy sat with a tablet, her face illuminated by the data that was currently acting as a digital noose around In-soo's neck. They weren't just attacking his company, they were performing a systemic erasure, removing his name from the ledger of the living. By 9 a.m., the first blow landed. In-soo was in the middle of a frantic board meeting when the doors were pushed open by federal investigators from the National Tax Service. They didn't come with questions, they came with boxes. The documents Ivy had meticulously organized over the past week, the hidden ledgers, the offshore gambling transfers, and the forged permits for the Gangnam project, were now evidence in a multi-million-dollar fraud investigation. In-soo watched, his mouth agape, as his hard drives were seized and his personal accounts were frozen in real time. The narrator noted the clinical silence of the room. The board members, men In-soo had considered his closest allies, didn't defend him. They simply stood up and walked out, their loyalty evaporating the moment his net worth hit the floor. But the erasure of Bora was a more intimate execution. Min-hyuk didn't target her finances. He targeted her oxygen, her social standing. While she was at a luxury boutique, attempting to buy her way out of her growing anxiety, every major socialite and influencer in Seoul received a synchronized notification. It was a leaked audio recording, crystal clear and devastatingly cold. It was Bora's voice from the night of the betrayal, gloating to her hidden benefactors about how easy it had been to dismantle Ivy's life. She actually thought I loved her. The recording hissed through 1,000 speakers. She was so blinded by her own kindness that she didn't see me sharpening the knife for 10 years. The boutique went silent. The clerk, who had been bowing to Bora moments before, pulled the credit card machine away. The women Bora had lunched with for years looked at her with a collective, frigid disgust. In the digital age, a social death is a permanent one. By noon, Bora's phone was a graveyard of blocked numbers and rescinded invitations. Her father's creditors, sensing the shift in the wind, began calling in her debts with a sudden, predatory urgency. Ivy watched the feet of Bora standing alone on the sidewalk, clutching her designer bag as if it could protect her from the stares of the passers-by. There was no joy in Ivy's eyes, only a quiet, settling peace. "Is it enough?" Min-hyuk asked, his voice low in the quiet office. "It's not about enough," Ivy replied, looking away from the screen. "It's about balance. They wanted me to be a shadow in their world. Now they are the ones fading out." The systemic erasure was total. By sunset, In-soo's architecture firm had been delisted, and Bora's name was a synonym for treachery in every corner of the city. They hadn't just lost their status, they had lost their foundation. Min-hyuk and Ivy had dismantled the world they stole, piece by clinical piece, leaving In-soo and Bora to wander the ruins of a life that no longer recognized their names. The victory felt like ash in Ivy's mouth the moment she stepped into Min-hyuk's private study and saw the file left open on the mahogany desk. It was a surveillance log dated weeks before the night at the Shilla. Her heart, which she thought had finally turned to stone, gave a sickening lurch. There, in cold, black and white print, was a detailed itinerary of In-soo's movements, and her own. She realized with a jolt of horror that Min-hyuk hadn't just been a witness in that hallway, he had been the architect of her presence there. The anonymous tip, the slightly ajar door, the perfectly timed intervention, it wasn't a coincidence of fate. It was a choreographed maneuver. Min-hyuk had known about the betrayal for months, and had waited for the exact moment Ivy's world would shatter to move in. He hadn't rescued her from the fire. He had let her burn until she was desperate enough to take his hand. When the heavy doors creaked open, and Min-hyuk stepped into the room, the air became heavy with the scent of rain and unspoken truths. Ivy didn't flinch. She turned the file toward him, her finger pressing against her own name on the log. "You didn't find me in that hallway, Min-hyuk," she said, her voice a low, vibrating chord of fury. "You placed me there. You knew In-soo was in room 412. You knew Bora had the key. You let me walk into that trauma because you needed a reason to freeze In-soo's assets, and I was the only one with the legal clearance to do it." Min-hyuk didn't look away. He didn't offer a lie to soften the blow. He walked to the desk, his presence looming over her, as unyielding as a mountain. In-soo was moving to sell the Kong Group's intellectual property to a rival syndicate. He was using your signature to authorize the transfers. If I had stopped him before that night, you would have gone to prison as his accomplice. So you used me as bait. Ivy spat, her eyes bright with a new, sharper kind of pain. You watched me stand at that door for 3 seconds and break. You watched the two people I loved most destroy me, and you waited in the shadows because it served your bottom line. How is that any different from what In-soo did? How is your protection anything more than a different kind of cage? Min-hyuk reached out, his hand hovering near her face, but he didn't touch her. The distance between them felt like a chasm. The difference, Ivy, is that I am not asking you to be small. I am not asking you to be an anchor for my ego. I gave you the tools to destroy them because I wanted you to see what you are capable of when you stop being a victim. You didn't give me tools, Ivy countered, stepping into his space, her gaze pinning him. You gave me your script. You traded my heart for a strategic advantage. You didn't claim me to save me. You claimed me to own the win. The confrontation hung in the air, a high-stakes standoff between power and trust. For the first time, the ice architect looked as though he were standing on shaking ground. The silence was enormous, a vacuum that threatened to pull them both under. Ivy realized then that she had jumped from one man's game into another's, but as she looked at Min-hyuk, she saw something In-soo never had. A flicker of genuine, terrifying respect. He wasn't her savior, and he wasn't her friend. He was the man who had shown her that in his world, trust was a luxury, and power was the only thing that didn't lie. The price of his protection was her innocence, and as she stood her ground, Ivy realized she had already paid it in full. 6 months after the lights went out in room 412, the world had been rewritten. In-soo was a name mentioned only in legal case studies regarding corporate fraud, his once sharp suits replaced by the drab uniform of a state-assigned cell. Bora had vanished from the city entirely. Rumor had it she was working a service job in a coastal town where no one knew her father's history or her own treachery. The narrator noted the poetic justice of their fates. They had wanted to be seen, and now they were effectively invisible. Ivy stood on the glass-railed balcony of the Kong Group's executive suite, 30 stories above the neon pulse of Seoul. The wind was cold, but she didn't pull her coat tighter. She had grown accustomed to the chill. Behind her, the heavy sliding doors hissed open, and the rhythmic click of leather shoes announced Kong Min-hyuk's arrival. He didn't stop a respectful distance away. He came to stand beside her, his silhouette merging with hers in the reflection of the glass. The merger with the Choi logistics firm is complete, Min-hyuk said, his voice no longer just an order, but a report. He handed her a leather-bound folder. The board was hesitant, but they realized that without your signature on the intellectual property release, the entire syndicate would stall. You have them in a deadlock. Ivy didn't look at the folder. She looked at the city, her eyes tracing the skylines she now helped dictate. I didn't sign it for the board, Min-hyuk. I signed it because it's time we stopped playing defense. She turned to face him, and the shift in power was absolute. She wasn't the woman who had collapsed in the hallway of the Shilla. She wasn't the legal translator who waited for his cues. She had spent the last few months learning every vulnerability in his architecture, every shadow in his syndicate. She hadn't just used his tools to destroy In-soo. She had used them to master Min-hyuk's world. She wasn't his mistress, and she was no longer his subordinate. She was the one who managed the architect. Min-hyuk watched her, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face, the look of a man who had finally met his match and found the experience exhilarating. You've grown quite comfortable in this chair, Ivy. Some might say you've become even more ruthless than I am. I learned from the best, she replied, her voice as steady as the horizon. But as the city lights flickered below, a new notification pinged on the secure tablet resting on the balcony table. It was an encrypted file from an untraceable source. Ivy swiped it open, and her blood went cold for the first time in months. It was a photograph of the hotel hallway from 6 months ago, taken from an angle that neither she nor Min-hyuk's cameras could have reached. Attached was a single line of text. The door wasn't open for you to leave, Ivy. It was open, so we could let someone else in. Ivy looked at Min-hyuk, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of genuine shock in his eyes. The war they thought they had won was merely the opening act. As the screen dimmed, the narrator's voice dropped to a whisper. In-soo and Bora were just the shadows. The real architect of Ashilla was still in the room. Ivy gripped the edge of the railing, her gaze hardening. Min-hyuk, she said quietly. Who else had a key to room 412?